This illustration became unenjoyable at the end, but I think that was still a good thing. So, whenever I do these types of illustrations that involve kind of a lot of aspects that are maybe more complicated or, in my opinion, outside of my current skill level, I think they can still be valuable to my process of wanting to improve just because they help to establish almost a benchmark of what I can currently do and identify some of the areas that I want to study in the future. At the same time, I also want to make sure that I uh, take note of just the times within the process where I'm not enjoying it. And I think that for me, there's a clear difference between a process that I want to just keep moving forward through and a process that I'm just actively not enjoying and that I want to just finish so that I can move on to something else. And I think at times this illustration almost became the second one, which was just me not really wanting to, for one, even draw the illustration and continue rendering out uh, the details, but also just wanting to move on to something else. And so it was something that I really wanted to take notice of because for as someone who wants to improve and wants to keep engaging with projects that are challenging and that force me to work on skills that maybe I haven't focused on as much, I think that it can be kind of a warning or set off a little bit of an alarm to have those cases where the process is not enjoyable. Because for the most part, I think a lot of these illustrations that I've done, especially recently, I haven't really enjoyed the final product so much as the process. I think that the final product is interesting and engaging for me to look at because of what I can notice about the process. But to be honest, I don't think that I was happy with a lot of the things that turned out with some of the previous illustrations. And so I think the same is true for this one, but I think that there were definitely aspects of the process that became much less enjoyable. And that's something for me to take note of. And I think that this part of the process, which was just trying to lay in the background, was probably the more enjoyable part of the process for me. I think I did kind of move into trying to render out and block out the Spider-Man figure in the middle once I was partially done with the background, but I still definitely enjoyed the 4-point perspective practice and just really seeing what I could do with that. And even kind of trying to do something that was otherwise very challenging and kind of grounding it a little bit, really seeing what I could do to make that whole process of rendering a background more realistic and more doable. But I did ultimately start rendering out the details on Spider-Man, and I think one aspect of this process was just the difficulty in a lot of cases with rendering the anatomy, especially with the legs, and getting that foreshortening of anatomy that I think was really necessary for uh, kind of trying to emulate the comics style that Spider-Man is usually in. And I think the nice thing about Spider-Man's character is that the poses that he's in are necessarily very dynamic, and it requires just a good amount of skill to be able to not only render in the anatomy portion, but to utilize a pose that feels fitting for the character. And so I think that was a really challenging part of the illustration that I don't think I was that wowed by the final outcome, but I think just the process of being able to try out a Spider-Man pose and try out just the process of putting in those details for a character that needs to sort of be in a very kind of anatomically correct, but also just dynamic kind of pose. And I think that it was just good practice. And for a lot of these illustrations, I really want to make sure that the elements of the illustration are including challenging aspects for me to be able to just practice rather than sticking with a single type of illustration or composition or perspective. Because for me, I think as someone who wants to just really focus in on identifying new studies and making the best use of my time, I really want to be able to try out different things, because for me to just try the same thing is more of a just kind of a way to in a sense, at least for me, stay a little bit more stationary when it comes to my skill set. And so I definitely want to be able to include elements in each illustration that I specifically feel like I need to work on, and that allows me to get the benchmark and allows me to see just the aspects of that process that went more inefficiently. And I do like having to work with this kind of deep shadow in a comics oriented style. I think it really forces me to study the forms of the anatomy and really try to make sure I can practice just rendering those shadows, because I think in looking at how a lot of professionals do it, you can look at those shadows and really see just the precision in how they're rendering out that anatomy using just very black and white kind of shadows instead of just relying fully on the painting aspect. So I think it was good practice just to go in and at least try to render those very deep shadows, and even to put in things like the patterns on Spider-Man's suit that really have to abide by the forms in his different the different parts of his costume. And I think that was also just a good challenge. I think doing patterns that have to kind of warp around aspects of the anatomy is something that I want to be able to practice a little bit more. And it's something I kind of did practice a little bit with, say, like Jolene's illustration. But I think being able to come back to something like that was also just good, because the more I'm able to engage with that, the more I'm able to essentially see how I can improve and be able to study more of that. And as you can see, I put in a little bit of the background, not quite the entire city, but I did put in the sky just to try and hopefully make the character feel a little bit more integrated into the rest of the illustration. And I think at this point I also realized for myself that there were aspects of the coloring process that I wanted to update for future illustrations. I think that just when it comes to the shadows, I would have preferred to have a style that was a little bit more bold and almost blocky with the color rendering, instead of feeling like it's constantly a very soft sort of light that doesn't have too much edge to it. Because I think when looking at different forms, there are those places that tend to have the softer light, but I think those tend to be the more rounded and kind of gradual forms rather than every aspect of that form. So I think it made me want to go back and just try out different types of brushes, because the nice thing about Procreate is that a lot of the basic brushes can really carry you far, and being able to test out ones with a little bit of a harder kind of edge to it and combining that with the brushes meant for a little bit softer edges. So I think there was definitely a lot of good takeaways. And in general, even though, as I said, I didn't really enjoy a lot of this process of, especially this process, for example, of having to go back and try to render out the legs because they didn't really look too right. And even really in the end, not being super satisfied with how it looked, but kind of going in, just having to make it at least a little bit more believable was not as enjoyable as I would have liked it to be. But in general, I think being able to experience an unenjoyable illustration can be valuable too, because it really forces me to think about ways that I could make it enjoyable and could return to the concepts and skills in a way that makes me want to try it again and makes me want to improve rather than avoid something like complicated backgrounds or avoid leg anatomy or things like that. Because if I'm not enjoying it, then there's definitely something about the process that I need to be aware of. And it's not necessarily an indicator that I'm just simply not good at certain things, but rather that there needs to be something that I almost latch onto when it comes to the process. And so with this background, I think I started to realize how much, even though it's supposed to be New York, how much it really doesn't feel like it has much personality or very distinct aspects to it. And I did use reference of New York. And so I did look at certain pictures of the skyline and tried to get a sense of the roof greebling, I guess we'll call it. But there weren't any buildings in this illustration that were actually part of New York. And I think in hindsight, that was something that I wanted to keep in mind, that this really didn't feel like a background with its own personality, but rather something that was just window dressing for the character in the middle. And I think that for me, in terms of the unenjoyable parts of rendering that background out, I think the lack of personality felt like a big reason, because when it comes to something like a background, if I spend a lot of time trying to render it out, I don't want to be seeing it as just something that is only meant to frame the rest of the photo or frame the rest of the illustration to kind of just make the character in the middle feel more believable. Because this whole cityscape is something that Spider-Man should be in. I mean, Spider-Man being in the city is his most common appearance, but the fact that it wasn't really New York and it was just kind of almost a proxy for New York, kind of just a bunch of boxes with some detailing on it, it really made it feel like the process of investing time into the background was not really worthwhile. Because if it's not really reflecting anything about the setting, which there's so much lore that goes into New York, and in hindsight, I think that there's so much that I could have included when it came to the background, but because of how I approached this illustration kind of without that mindset, it ended up being a lot more unenjoyable than I think it needed to be. And I think it was even something that studying architecture and really studying how to work with the forms of buildings didn't feel like a, I guess, solution to. It didn't really feel like something that more studies could really address, because I think even then I would have felt like there's just not much interest in spending that much time rendering out something, even if I feel more skilled and more used to the process of rendering those buildings. So that was something to really keep in mind, that even with having more studies, I don't think this would have really felt more enjoyable. And I think the lack of the personality, for me, in my opinion, was a big part of this, because even at this point with trying to paint in the rest of the background, I was really struggling with trying to really get much of a sense of even just what I should be shadowing and arranging in a certain way. I think I kind of knew that I wanted to frame the character in the middle using light, but there really wasn't much of a detail in the background that I really wanted to focus on. And again, it was kind of just a lot of blocking in different cubes and putting windows on those cubes, rather than something that was made with its own sort of appeal and its own set of details that I wanted to invest more time into. So I did still enjoy the painting process a little bit. I think just the ability to use a lot of different brushes is something that's kind of nice with digital, is that I'm able to play around with just a lot of very differently textured brushes to get in some new details when it comes to the background and make it feel less kind of flat. But I think towards the end of this illustration, I kind of felt like just that I wanted to be over with it. And as you'll see later, I do spend a little bit of time just very almost scribbling in ink outlines, because it didn't feel like Spider-Man and the background were very well integrated. But I really did not enjoy that part of the process. And ultimately, I decided to hide that layer because I just wasn't very happy with how it turned out. It just felt very rushed, and I almost feel like it detracted from the composition a little bit because of just how messy it looked. So I still think that it was good to walk through this process, but again, there were definitely some frustrations with it, and those are things I want to take forward. So yeah, I think it was still very interesting.